Hey guys, so we've been through a bit of a elaborate discussion on the theory of Sartre's existentialism, and what we want to do now is recap on that just an itty bit, and then we want to move from there and have a look at some of the conclusions that Sartre made using this theory. And these conclusions are deeply held conclusions about what it means to be a human being, which is where the term existentialism comes from, because we can now look at how a human being exists, or what it means to be a human being, and the existence of a human being, for want of a better term. So we're going to revise previous theory and elaborate on further conclusions. That's the overall goal we want to achieve, which means that we have to achieve these three smaller goals. We need to revise previous concepts covered in other videos. Can you write that down and score yourself? Then we need to use theory to make further conclusions about human existence. How do humans exist? What are their fundamental conditions? Can you write that down and score yourself out of 4? And of course we want to use pop culture as a way in to make sense of these conclusions and to really bring home what they mean. So can you write number 3 down and score yourself out of 4? Then, as an APK, I would like you to draw me a picture of your favourite villain, and that'll become apparent when we talk about Thanos later on. Well, sorry, the reason for why we did that will become apparent, okay? Alright, so let's go back and do a little bit of revision. Yeah, these ones are a bit too wordy for my liking, but I had to do this when I was having an interactive discussion with a key group. And what we were doing basically was talking and trying to note-take keywords around pictures during a workshop. And we wanted to just really record our thoughts in words as well as pictures. But like I said, all the research says that talking to words doesn't work. Talking to pictures works better. So let's recap. We've kind of got a dichotomy, which means a way of splitting things into two here, where we talk about the inner self being and the for itself being. And as we said before, an inner self being has its essence fully contained within it and it doesn't change. But a for itself being is constantly going through the process of creating its essence. And that's what a human being is, okay? How does that happen? Well, through the process of negating a nothingness when you're a human being. And we want to look at Sabrina, because we were talking in our group. We said, well, what is it? What's a favourite Netflix series that you guys are all watching at the moment, and how can we use that as a way of exemplifying this process of negating a nothingness? Okay, so we talked about the first episode that was aired, and we talked about the process of growing through negating nothingness at the core of your being and by creating a future. So just to recap, if we negate a negative, we make a positive. So if we negate an absence, we make a presence. If we negate a -1, we make a +1. If we negate a nothing, we create a something. All right. So Sabrina has a key choice at the front, at the start of the very first episode in the series season 1, all right, and she sees Miss Vaudeville, and she invites Miss Vaudeville to come and discuss the film. Now, in the process of doing that, she could just pretend Miss Vaudeville didn't exist, or she could find an excuse to just completely ignore her, or she could say hello and not invite her. But she chose one option, and she committed to it with action, and therefore made that future, that possible future, a reality. It was negated from a possibility to an actuality. And she said something about herself. Her essence was negated, and she grew as a human being because she defines herself as somebody who is sympathetic and towards people who may be a bit isolated. She doesn't want to leave them alone. So she grows as a human being, all right? So her essence is defined. She's a teenage girl. She's into horror. She has a boyfriend. She values friendship. She's welcoming, friendly, non-judgmental, socially curious, and non-conventional. That's who she is. That's her essence at this point in time. And I guess when she negates this nothingness by inviting Miss Vaudeville, her teacher, to talk with her about a horror film that she saw, she, in effect, says she's also someone who has some compassion, okay? And she adds to it. She adds to herself. Then we watch the series a bit more, and we see a situation where a bat flies through a window, and that bat is in pain. And she has a choice. She could leave it alone, She could nurture the bat back to health, or she could just kill the bat and put it out of its misery. And again, she's got options, 3 hypothetical options. When the bat comes through her window and is there injured on her floor, she chooses to kill the bat. And in the process, she takes a possibility and negates it into an actuality, and she makes something out of nothing. And she defines her essence by making a core nothingness right at the core of her being into something and adding to her essence. She's a teenage girl who now values life. She values being merciful, but we also find out later on she chooses to bury the bat, which shows that she does value the life of the bat as well, because she chose to actually bury it. And what we've got here is we've got a pop culture example of, well, okay, how does one go through the process of growth? It's by negating nothingness at the core of their being and by negating a possibility into an actuality. And it's very key to Sartre's theory. What we need to again remember is that you can't actually grow as a human being without actually committing to the action, because by committing to the action you affirm, you say this is something that's really important, and you actually affirm a core part of yourself and you make it real. By just considering it as a hypothetical but not acting upon it, you don't actually make that key choice to make this something concrete and something you value. Okay, so just spend a bit of time to take some notes and maybe draw some pictures that further recap on that theory. Alright, now if we go down and let's look at another popular culture example. Let's look at Thanos. And if you've watched Endgame, what you realise is that Thanos chooses to sacrifice his beloved adopted daughter Gamora for the sake of his mission, which is basically to kill half of the universe. I don't understand why he just didn't double the resources in the universe. I'm going to be really honest about that. But he chose to basically wipe out half of the universe so that way he could preserve the other half of the universe by giving it enough resources. You know, I don't ever want my children to play musical chairs with Thanos' children, ever, because, you know, if I just say bring in extra chairs, but his idea is basically, you know, just wipe them out. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's his choice, and he chooses the only way he can get the rings of power. So typical fantasy and superhero and this. The only way he basically can do that is he has to make a sacrifice of something he deeply, truly loves. So he's got an internal struggle, okay? Do I sacrifice something I really value, I really love for the sake of my mission? Or do I give up my mission and kind of affirm that what I love is even greater and more important? And in some ways, this is what we would call an arbitrary or random kind of choice, because in Thanos' mind, and I'm not saying that it would be in your mind because we're not psychopaths, all right, but in Thanos' mind, these are 2 equally valid choices. That's key. You've got to remember that. So what he chooses is basically to sacrifice Gamora by killing her, and then he gets one of the rings and he can achieve his mission. But in his mind, these are like, I have to make a choice. Now, what choice I make, nobody can really advise me on, because they kind of have an equal sense of importance. But you know what? At the end of the day, a choice is still needed. So a random or arbitrary choice is really key to a lot of these decisions that are made. I want you to take a note. Now, I like the random or arbitrary choice that Sartre gives us, and I don't know if I've got it here in my visuals. I don't think I have. No, I haven't got it here. And it's basically that Sartre is asked by a young resistance fighter whether or not he should look after his sick grandmother and nurse her until she passes away, or go fight against the Nazis because it looks like he can play a role in bringing the Nazis down in France. And Sartre says this really strange thing. He says, look, I have no advice for you, and you have, there's no advice you can give yourself either, because both of these options are equally as valid, equally as important. But you have to make a choice. You can't run away from it. So choose one, and whether you like it or not, ultimately that choice will define who you are, and it will make a concrete part of your future. Now, This causes a lot of anxiety to the soldier, but the soldier ultimately chooses to go fight the Nazis. And in the process, he creates a future for himself out of nothing, because he takes that possibility and negates it into an actuality. But he also defines himself as someone who believes that fighting the Nazis is more important. Yeah. So that's a classic example, and you might want to stop now and think about finding an example of anywhere in film or in literature where you can think of an arbitrary choice, where there are 2 or 3 possible options. One has to be chosen, but they're all equally as valid. And tell us about the choice that the character made and what that choice said about themselves. How did it create an essence? So the point that Sartre is making here through the arbitrary example here is that, well, you have what's called a radical freedom. And by radical freedom, he's talking about a type of freedom where it's not just the freedom to do whatever you want. It's not that kind of freedom where I can just buy lots of stuff and do whatever I want. It's not the freedom to also walk away from things that are holding me back or to fight the oppressed. This radical freedom really is about being in a situation where you have choices and you alone make that choice. And sometimes those choices are going to be arbitrary. Sometimes you have to choose one thing over the other, even though they're equally as important. And the reason why it's arbitrary is because the reason for choosing there's no reason. You just chose. Yeah. So take a note. So radical freedom is an acknowledgement that you have to choose. No one can choose for you. Now, you can't choose your facticity. Remember that term, facticity. Your facticity is given to you. You know, if you are, you obviously can't choose to fly right now if you wanted. You know, just go, oh, I'm going to just will myself to levitate. You can't do that. Facticity limits that. It says no. But within the facticity that you've got options, right? And you have to choose which option you want to make real. That's what radical freedom's all about. It's about choosing within your facticity what option you're going to make a reality and what you're going to say about yourself or who you become. Take a note. So radical freedom really is the process of making these decisions alone, and you know, no, people might tell you to do something, but you can't really say, yeah, you made the decision. You still have to make the choice to do what you're told or to rebel against it. So this choice is completely and utterly, these choices you make in your life are completely and utterly yours to make. No one can make them for you. Take a note. And he argues that this is why human beings tend to feel what we call an anxiety. There's always an underlying kind of angst or an anxiety that we feel right at the back of our being, at the back of ourselves, because we are alone when we make choices. I mean, we might have advice and everything like that, but ultimately we're the ones that have to make the choice within the limits of our facticity, okay? It also makes us feel depressed. Not only are we depressed because we have to make the choices and there's no help, there's that loneliness, but we are also, in a weird way, responsible for others, because whenever we decide to act on something and make it meaningful for us, we in turn are signifying to the rest of the world that if you had the same facticity, if you had the same history shaping who you are today, then you should make the same choice. You're making decisions through your actions about what other people should be like, how other people should define their essence. So you're kind of responsible not just for yourself, but you're responsible for mankind, because your actions signify what mankind should do in exactly the same situation. Take a note. All right. So this is where a famous comment comes from our main man. It's called, "Man is condemned to be free." Now, I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to tell me where's the, write down, see if you can predict or already find out, where's the contradiction in this statement? All right, so this is an oxymoron, right? Because an oxymoron, if you don't know what it is, it's a statement where you say one thing that contradicts the other. or we could even say negates the other, like we could say, like a stupid academic, even though there are probably some stupid academics, you'd say academics are highly intelligent people because they've studied a lot, right? So why would you say stupid academic? The two disagree with each other. Or you would say, what's another, loud silence, which is used a lot in poetry, that kind of thing, where the silence just stands out so loud, but obviously it's silent, so how can it be loud? That's what an oxymoron is, right? And if you look at this phrase, freedom implies the opposite of being forced to do anything. But condemned means, in a sad way, being forced to be free. But freedom, total absolute freedom, requires to not be forced at all. But what Sartre is saying is that, well, actually, you're forced to be free. So there's a huge contradiction that lies here. And the reason why he says this is because, you know what? A lot of people would actually like to not be free. Because then they don't have to worry. Then they don't have to be anxious. But the sad fact is, the human condition is that you have to be free. It's just humanity. That's the way it works. So this saying, man is condemned to be free, is integral to understanding the conclusion Sartre makes when he accepts the fact that we negate a nothingness at the core of our being and we choose possibilities and convert them into actualities through choices and actions. Yeah? We alone do it. We cannot help but do it. We have to do it, but we don't like doing it because we're ultimately responsible. Take a note. Now, this is the last key point. It's a really important point to make, all right? And it's called the concept of bad faith. All right, let's look at Thenos again, for example, okay? Now, Thenos can blame the mission. He can blame even his facticity. He said, look, I didn't really want to sacrifice Gamora, but I had to, because it was the only way for me to get the stone and to achieve my mission. So they made me do it. The second he says they made me do it is the second he's lying to himself, effectively. Because he still had a choice. He could choose to value Gamora over the ring and keep her alive and give up on his mission, or he could choose to go through his mission. He can't really argue that they made me do it. He really did do it. But time and time and time again, people always argue that they made me do it. Yeah? And that is what Sartre calls bad faith. Bad faith is when you pretend that someone else is responsible for your decisions. So, again, let's just look at that from a Sartrean point of view. Okay, imagine if you're someone, let's use it in a modern context. Imagine if you're someone who believes that gay marriage is sinful and marriage should be between a man and a woman. Same old kind of conservative adage. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? I'm not saying that's what I believe, but I'm just giving you an example, and I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't believe those things. That's really important. But you can't say that you believe something because God told you to believe it, or because it's God's will, or because the priest told you this is right or wrong. At the end of the day, Sartre would argue, no, this might have been advice that was given to you. This might have been part of your facticity where these belief systems were given to you. But you still chose to take them on board. It's your choice to believe that. Okay? So if you blame God for a decision that you made, well, you know what? You can't really do that. That's bad faith. But if you're an atheist and you also blame, history or other extenuating circumstances, well, guess what? No, it's bad faith. You still chose to make those decisions. And that's how he kind of explains the responsibility for the Nazis. A lot of people would say, well, I didn't really have any power, or, in this situation I'm not responsible because I was just following orders. Well, you know what? You chose to follow the orders. Now, you might be thinking that's really tough because, people have families to feed, other people to consider, other things to look after. And Sartre would say, yeah, that's true. I'm not saying necessarily that your decision was the wrong or right decision to make, but you're still responsible for it. Take a note. So there tends to be this thing of bad faith, which is where people lie to themselves and pretend that other people are responsible for their decisions, when that's just impossible. You are responsible. Even if God told you to do something, you still need to choose to follow God's will. Even if God doesn't exist, but you've been forced by history into a particular class where you need to steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, which is fair enough, you still chose to keep your family alive and steal a loaf, but you're still responsible for it. Do you know what I mean? Now, why do people do this? Why do people pretend that other people are responsible for the decisions that they make? It's because they don't want to die. Take a note. Because when you think about it, decisions that you make are like climbing a ledge of growth. You're constantly climbing a cliff. And if you make the wrong decision, you could fall back again in terms of how you wanted to advance or what you wanted to do in your life. Or you could fall off the cliff. You could end up dying. And so there's a tendency for people to just want to stay where they are, which is impossible. Absolutely impossible. Because life requires choice. Life requires action. You can't help but live without it. But people might not want to acknowledge that and give other people responsibility. And have the illusion that they're staying in the same spot, even though they're moving. It's just other people are moving them up the ledge for them, right? So you can understand that, because nobody wants to be responsible for the death, or nobody wants to be responsible for falling back on hard times. Nobody wants that. But ultimately, it's just part of nature. It's part of how we exist as human beings. You've got to make the choices. So to choose, when you argue something in bad faith, they made me do it. I'm a God-fearing person, therefore I decided that I would do it. It's God, I'm not responsible. All those kind of arguments. What you're in effect doing is you're making decisions in bad faith by convincing yourself that you are not responsible. Take a note. And that's because you don't want to be the one who made the mistake. Take a note. Now, I just want to leave you on a classic example. I can't remember the book where this example comes from, but it is where bad faith is such an integral part of normal life. It doesn't have to be these major, big decisions. So I think it was Sartre, or maybe it was another philosopher. They were talking about a lady who was invited out for dinner by a man. And she doesn't really know how she feels about the man. She's in two minds about it. She could imagine a future with this man, and she could imagine a really happy, wonderful future. But at the same time, she might want to go out and live a free-spirited life, and she doesn't want to be held back. So she goes out for dinner, and the man takes her by the hand at the table, and she doesn't actually choose to squeeze the hand back, but she doesn't take the hand away. She leaves it in there, but just by leaving it there but not reacting, she's kind of making a decision in bad faith to say, well, I'm leaving this in your hands. I'm leaving this in the man's hand. And to pretend that she's not responsible for what will happen in the future. But ultimately she is. She chose to give him the responsibility. And that's how bad faith is something that kind of replicates itself again and again and again throughout life, all the time. And Sartre argues that the meaning of life is to make decisions that are authentic. Make decisions that are not made in bad faith. Acknowledge your responsibility in radical freedom. Take it head on. Wrestle with it. And in the process, you'll become a much better, authentic human being. Alright, so what have we done today? Did we revise our previous concepts? Absolutely, we certainly did. Did we use theory to make further conclusions about human existence? Completely. Forlornness, anxiety, radical freedom, bad faith, they're all there. Did we use pop culture to discuss this? Absolutely. We talked about Thanos, the sacrifice of Gamora, and how it could be interpreted using bad faith. But ultimately, he's still responsible. So I think we covered all of these. Can you just score yourself out of 4 and tell me what you think? And then I want you to go here and I want you to discuss a moment in this ELQ. Discuss a moment in a movie where a character is acted out of bad faith. And try and make sure you meet the criteria when you do it. Thank you very much.